Let's open our Bibles to Genesis chapter 3. We are going to look tonight at what is one of the crucial events in human history. Perhaps next to the birth of Jesus and his resurrection, the fall has impacted human history more than anything else. There are so many of the experiences and actions that we as human beings have that find their explanation in the fall. We will understand them. As a matter of fact, what are some of the things that we find in this chapter on the fall that can explain a lot of things that go on in the world? Deceit. Disobedience. Yeah.
Suffering.
Pardon me? Death. Absolutely. Shame.
Labor.
Both kinds.
You know, now that's yes, both kinds. That's right. Yeah, that's very good. I need a symbol here. And I don't know that there's a place for us to find more information on it. One wonders what childbirth would have been like pre-fall.
Yeah.
We do know that there was physical labor. There was toil that went on in the garden before the fall. And just what might that have been like? We're probably at least 2, if not 3 weeks in this chapter. And I'd like to begin with where the chapter actually begins, with the serpent. The serpent was more crafty. The word serpent is kind of an interesting word. It's unique in that it comes from the sound that a snake makes. I mean, this is actually in the Hebrew dictionary. You might hearken back to a literature class that you had in high school, where they talked about different literary devices, and one of them, there's a big long word there that begins with O, onomatopoeia. You're not going to be tested on that. But what it is it's a word that the sound that's made is actually what the word becomes. For instance, tap. The word tap comes because it sounds like a tap. Or the word click or snap. It's the word that we use comes from the sound that is made, and we make a word out of the sound. Am I making sense to you? Okay? So the serpent was given its name because of the hissing sound that it made. So in the Hebrew language, this word is derived from the sound that the animal makes. Now, there's something important about that, because this word was associated with, and if you look it up in the dictionary, you'll find out the first thing that it says is it is associated with divination, or with people who practice dark arts. But it's called that because they whisper, or they speak on the sly, quietly, as if they're trying to pull you aside and lure you into a conversation and whisper a secret to you that maybe somebody else either you shouldn't know, or something that they don't want someone else to hear. Okay? And so that whole concept is tied up with the serpent who comes now to deceive Eve. Does that help in your picture there? Here's the serpent coming up to Eve, and he's whispering to her to draw her away from what God has called her to be and what God has called her to do. So there is this secret, on-the-sly effort that is, according to what the dictionary tells us, is bound up in the serpent itself, in how the serpent works, and how the serpent is perceived. And there is this blending of witchcraft and divination and fortune-telling, that kind of thing, with the sound of a serpent. There's another element in the meaning of the word serpent that reflects the character of not only this serpent, but the adversary that we face. And it's about the third meaning in the list, third or fourth meaning in the list in the dictionary. And it means to observe signs and to diligently observe or learn by experience. But it's observation with a dark side to it. It's observation that comes like an enchanter who's wanting to read tea leaves, or an enchanter who's wanting to read tarot cards. Anything that would have a spiritual attempt, a non-godly spiritual attempt to try to what they call divine some kind of wisdom. Okay? Does that make sense? Gain some kind of spiritual insight that comes, they call it divining, but it has nothing to do with God. Gain some kind of spiritual insight or wisdom through reading the cloud formations. Okay? You're talking about the horoscope or astrology. Reading tea leaves. But do you get the mysterious nature of this? The dark side. It's the sly side. Okay, so that's all bound up in this description of the serpent. Just the word serpent. It's all bound up in that. So when we are being told that the serpent comes, that's the way he's coming. A medium would be another expression of this. You know, and this whole idea of being quiet and in the corners and in the shadows, that sort of thing. It's this whispering element. It's this, well, you know, we're really not supposed to talk about this, but let me pull you aside and let me tell you what's going on. Okay. Yeah. Okay. But along with it, there is this observation element that the serpent was doing. Now, granted, at this point, you know, it's probably just Adam and Eve. But from this, we understand that the serpent is watching. The serpent is observing. He's paying attention to what's going on because it's part of who he is. It's part of his character. It's part of how he works. And he's looking for something. There are at least two passages. This is 1a4. There are at least two passages in other locations in the Scriptures that indicate this side of Satan's nature. Would someone turn to Job, the first chapter, verses 7 and 8, and then would someone else turn to 1 Peter 5:8. Satan is going back and forth throughout the earth, okay, checking things out. Okay, now how do we know he's looking?
Because God asks us, have you considered Job?
In all the traveling about that you're doing, have you considered have you taken a good look, we could say, at my servant Job? Well, we see the first picture of that here in Genesis 3. With Satan, he didn't have a long way to go because he only had two people to look for. But he was watching. He was watching. And he approached Eve. Okay? 1 Peter. I got it. Okay, Gary?
Stay alert. Watch out for your great enemy, the devil. He prowls around like a roaring lion, looking for someone to devour.
Okay. Read that last bit. Looking for
someone.
Looking for someone to devour. Okay? Here's the observation element. When you're on the prowl, how open are you about it? No, you're not. You're not open about it at all. You're sly. I'm just hanging out. I'm just hanging out. And you're watching everything that's going on. Okay? And that's the picture we get here of Satan. And it goes all the way back to Genesis 3, where we see in the garden, here's the serpent who is going about, and he's observing Adam and Eve, and he's looking for a place that he can begin his point of temptation. He's looking for that opportunity. From his earliest mention in the Scripture, Satan has remained true to this method of approach. If Satan can remain true to anything, he has remained true to this approach. John 8:44 talks about him being the father of lies, and I love what it says, the way it says it. Let's see. John 8:44, it says, Jesus is talking to some of the religious leaders, and he said, "You belong to your father, the devil, and you want to carry out your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning, not holding to the truth, for there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks his native language, for he is a liar and the father of lies." I love that. He speaks his native language when he's lying. Just like we speak English, he speaks lie. What are the implications? Jesus says that he is the father of lies and there is no truth in him. I have a friend who says that one of our difficulties in dealing with the temptations that Satan tosses our way is that there's just enough truth in them to make them believable. Just enough. Very good. It's not likely that he's going to all of a sudden begin to dispense truth, is it? Yeah. And yet, isn't it interesting that we buy his lie? Eve did. Interesting, isn't it? Before we go too much further into that, let's look at the next thing it says. So we have the serpent who was this quiet, stealthy, whisperer, sneaky guy who is observing us and looking for a point of entry. The serpent was more crafty. I have to tell you, folks, when I looked at this passage this afternoon, it simply reaffirmed to me the importance that we have to know what these words mean when we're reading them. And you can't just read them in your English language. Sometimes you got to get into a dictionary and find out what they mean. You'll see what I mean in just a second. The serpent was not only observant and sneaky, but he was crafty. And the word crafty in the Hebrew language there means to make naked. To make naked. Now, in light of what we've just been talking about in previous weeks, what does chapter 2 end with?
They were naked and not ashamed.
They were naked and not ashamed. What does Adam say to God when God comes looking for him in the garden. I'm naked and I'm ashamed. There's naked and then there's naked. There's the naked that was going on at the end of chapter 2. That is a wonderfully appropriate part of married life. But there is a nakedness that Satan comes to inflict on us, and it is part of his craftiness. He wants, think of it in these terms, he wants to strip us bare and to rob us of whatever dignity, whatever identity that we have. The craftiness that Satan is utilizing here is not just sneakiness. He wants to absolutely crush us and rob us of every bit of the sense of personhood and relationship with God that God invested in us when he made us. And that is when it says the serpent was more crafty. That's what it's talking about. Yeah. By the way, I had to stop myself when we were reading a minute ago about Adam and Eve sewing leaves together. I saw a cartoon this week. And it was Eve and Adam in the garden, and Eve is raking. And she says, I am so sick of raking up your clothes. I am so sick of raking up your clothes.
That's funny.
Satan, and here's where the observation element of what he does becomes so important, is he observes where we're vulnerable so that he can then use that point of vulnerability to come in and to take from us the personhood and the dignity that God has given us. That's why he's watching so carefully. But what we can't miss in this, because we are not just invaluable pawns.
He wants us to think that.
He wants us to think that. But there is also his intent to hurt us because we have relationship with God. And he wants to bring pain and suffering not just to God, but to us too. He wants to hurt us. And in the process, that ultimately, I can't, sometimes I'll think about all the people who've died and who've left this world knowing that they have no relationship with God, and I wonder about God's thoughts on that. I was thinking about it last week, about broad is the path that leads to destruction, and many people will find that. Narrow is the way and the gate that leads to eternal life, and few will find that. And I was just thinking about, God, what are your thoughts on that? How does that make you feel? That all of these people that you created in your image with the capacity to know and love you, they're going to go out into a godless eternity. I don't know. I'm sure there's a certain measure of pain that causes God. And yet, being God, how does he handle all that? I don't know. I don't think he is so racked with pain that he's immobilized, as perhaps we might be in that situation. And yet, there's great pain that I do think that inflicts on him. This whole discussion tells us something about the person that we are battling. We've already dealt with the issue of that he does not tell the truth, and that his ultimate end is to humiliate and ultimately condemn every human possible, while he is doing everything that he can to wreak havoc and disturb God's kingdom. He's looking for our weaknesses or looking for weak seasons of life. Times when you and I are more vulnerable. Sometimes our vulnerabilities are unique to us. There are some folks that theft isn't a problem. Other people, theft is a major problem. It's just kind of how they're wired. And that's part of what Satan is observing. He's observing, where can I find a weak place? We don't know what Eve was going through at this point in her life. But do you find it interesting that she was even willing to entertain the idea that somehow God was holding out on them, that God was unfair to them? That because they couldn't eat from the one tree, that somehow God had treated them inappropriately. Do you find that almost hard to imagine? Revelation 12 describes Satan as the great serpent. And harkens back to that. So we're not given this black and white division. Is it odd that a serpent could communicate to Eve? I would think so. I would think that would be outside the norm of what the other animals were capable of doing. So that probably should have been Eve's first clue. Something unusual is going on here. Okay? But there also seems to be the idea that Satan has somehow taken over this serpent and is using the serpent as a way to beguile Eve. That's what seems to me as I look at the text. That's what most of the folks that I've read after who are commenting on this say as well. That's what it appears that's going on here. So it was a snake, but the spirit of Satan was somehow working through that snake in order to entice Eve. Verse 6. When the woman saw the fruit of the tree was good for food, and it was pleasing to the eye, and also desirable for gaining wisdom. There are mental processes going on there, folks.
Oh, okay.
There are conscious mental processes that are going on here, that she saw the fruit on the tree. God said, don't eat it, it'll bring death. And she looked at it and she said, sure would taste good.
Possible she didn't always get it.
Yeah.
Just,
But did she think that before? The thing is,
No,
has she
after.
been thinking that before or after?
That's in response to the temptation. He says, you're not going to die.
Okay, when he made that statement, that's when she...
And she looked at the tree, and my word, not the Bible word, but she began to lust for what was on the tree.
Oh, okay,
Yes, she
okay.
did.
Okay? That's a choice. That's a choice when our desires are... And here, okay, folks, here's where we wrap this tonight. Here's the issue. Because here's what Satan is trying to do to all of us. This is why this chapter is important. Because he wants to strip us all. He wants to find the point of vulnerability, and he wants to rob you of the very thing that God has invested in you, your uniqueness, your place here in the earth, your place in his kingdom, all that he has in store for you. It's a parallel situation to Esau, who sold his father's birthright. And what we don't always know is the birthright carried with it a spiritual blessing. Not just the double portion of the father's inheritance. It came with the spiritual heritage to be the spiritual leader of the family. And Esau chose to eat some red stew rather than to step into the destiny that God had for him. Okay. I don't either, Vern. And I'll tell you, it's just as difficult for me to understand how Adam and Eve could have lived in the kind of context that they lived. And one time Satan comes along And he says, you know what? And matter of fact, one of the commentators that I was looking at today, let me see if I can find it real quick here. It's point C3 on this second page. His temptation is that all you have is not enough. You've got everything that God created, and that's not enough. And that is exactly what Satan is trying to do to each one of us. And that's deception, pulls us off into the dark, whispers to us, hey, I got something better for you. Okay? And we get drawn into it if we're not aware. What does Paul say? We're not ignorant of his devices. We know what he's doing. Okay? We'll pick this up again next week. Okay? Blessings on you. Have a great week.
This was interesting.